I'm Dan Kurtz-Phelan, and this is the Foreign Affairs Interview.
What is amazing to me is that amidst this state of marginalization that has taken place ever since late February, when the Iran war started, is basically people lost sight, it seems to me, of the human condition in Gaza. A lot of haggle about what needs to happen first, whether it's Hamas disarming or not disarming, Israel withdrawing, not withdrawing. But what about that immediately needed intervention to begin to introduce improvements in the livelihood of people? So that, to me, is really catastrophic.
In the 9 months since a ceasefire ended full-on war in Gaza, the world's attention has in many ways moved on. That has been especially true since February with the start of a war elsewhere in the Middle East. But the situation in Gaza remains grim and unsettled, and the situation in the West Bank has become increasingly fraught. Meanwhile, the way forward for Palestinian politics remains murky, while the prospect of any durable resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict seems more remote than ever. Salam Fayyad served as Prime Minister of the Palestinian Authority from 2007 to 2013 after a long career at the International Monetary Fund. Fayyad is still considered in many capitals, including Washington, one of the most effective Palestinian leaders of recent decades, and he has, in the past few years, laid out a series of proposals, including in the pages of Foreign Affairs, for building a Palestinian state, delivering humane and effective governance in Gaza, and finding a viable way forward for the Palestinian cause. I spoke with Fayyad on July 15th at the Aspen Security Forum. Before we get started, a reminder for any listeners who are not yet subscribers to Foreign Affairs. For one more week, take advantage of our special promotion. New subscribers can save $10 on an annual subscription, which gets you our bi-monthly print issues, daily essays on our website, our newsletters, and more. Through the end of July, head to foreignaffairs.com/July to claim your offer. Again, that's foreignaffairs.com/July. Salam, thank you for doing this. You've laid out in our pages on a couple of occasions your vision and your strategy for Palestinian leadership, for Gaza, for the Israeli-Palestinian relationship. But it's been a couple of years and a lot has happened since then. So it's wonderful to have the chance to talk to you.
Great pleasure to be with you, Dan. Thank you.
It's almost astonishing how much the Palestinian issue, whether Gaza or the West Bank or the future of the Palestinian movement more broadly, has fallen out of the global discussion since the Gaza ceasefire last year, and especially since the start of the war in Iran in February. So I thought it'd be useful to start by hearing your basic explanation, your understanding of where we are. Let's start with Gaza and go back to the ceasefire. What has happened in Gaza since, and where does the situation stand now as you see it?
A lot has happened by way of getting ready to do something about Gaza, beginning with the ceasefire, which was, of course, a big deal when it happened. After so many attempts at trying to get there, to finally get to the point where we had a ceasefire was important in and of itself. Then, of course, border peace came into the picture, and Trump's plan and the Security Council resolution that enshrined that. And there was a lot of activity. And then, of course, the Iran war happened. And when that happened, that produced a situation where the entire Palestinian issue, including Gaza, was shoved to the side, not much on it. You leaf through the papers in the United States. It's rarely the case. After many, many months of Gaza being in the news, headlines and all, it very surely completely disappeared. Things didn't quite work out the way the Trump plan was promoted as intended to accomplish, and that was even before the war. Some difficulties actually were encountered because going back to the days when the deal was struck, it was obvious that the parties, namely Hamas and Israel, were not really on board with everything that was expected of them. Hamas, for example, question of disarmament, Israel question of withdrawal, and all of that. But if you look at the situation since then, Israeli raids never stopped. More than 1,000 Palestinians have been killed since the ceasefire went into effect. So whereas like a full-scale war in the way that was taking place in Gaza before the ceasefire kind of stopped, nevertheless, violence is still there, and a lot of people continue to lose their life every day. So you have that going on. Not much happened by way of improving or beginning to improve on the livelihood of people, the human condition in Gaza. where a lot of people remain without shelter, not to mention food, water, electricity, basic necessities. And what is amazing to me is that amidst this state of marginalization that has taken place ever since late February, when the Iran war started, is basically people lost sight, it seems to me, of the human condition in Gaza. A lot of haggle about what needs to happen first, whether it's Hamas disarming or not disarming, Israel withdrawing, not withdrawing. But what about that immediately needed intervention to begin to introduce improvements in the livelihood of people? So that, to me, is really catastrophic. I mean, that's something that needs to be addressed very quickly. So marginalization, yes, pretty much as the situation in the West Bank was marginalized by what was going on in Gaza long before the U.S.-Israel-Iran war started in late February. So a lot of bad things happening in the West Bank, and that was not really getting coverage, obviously because of the depth of the crisis in Gaza and how more serious that was. But of course, what was happening in the West Bank, not only was it very destructive in terms of daily lives of Palestinians who reside in the West Bank, but in terms of the longer-term prospects of ever really getting to a situation where Palestinians can, at long last, live as free people in a country of their own. I mean, when you look at the de facto annexation that has taken place, settlement activity, new settlements built, roads constructed, infrastructure, and what have you, in the West Bank, by a government that is absolutely clear on its intent. Either you comply fully with what they expect you to do as a Palestinian, or you have no place in that area. Leave or die. So that literally is the rhetoric that some Israeli officials on the current government have been using.
Do you understand the escalation in settler violence as part of a, more or less coordinated drive to get Palestinians out of the West Bank? I mean, how do you see that as part of this picture?
I was in government when it started to read its ugly head. I mean, there's a lot of hatred there in those acts of violence, and I think I was first to call them acts of terror. And some Israeli officials actually followed suit. That was back in, I believe, 2009, 2010, something like that, when settlers started to torch, for example, places of worship, mosques and what have you, burning olive trees and whatnot, and attacking Palestinians. The scale has gone up dramatically over the years, and particularly under the current government. It is almost by definition the case that this is policy, it seems to me, because settlers do what they do. These violent ones, the extremists, they're doing what they do with full protection with the Israeli army. I mean, there's no question about that. And Israel knows how to stop these acts of terror if it really actually wants to. So if that continues to go unabated, that cannot but lead one to the conclusion that it's happening because it represents policy. It is intended to drive Palestinians away from their land, as has happened in many areas in the Jordan Valley, in the North and West Bank, and all of that. You have similar situation going on in the Southern West Bank, in the Hebron area. So when you listen to what Israeli officials are saying about their own vision for future of Israel and what have you, and see what's happening on the ground, how can you not conclude but that it's really policy? And it's really all ascribed to settlers who have these tendencies full of hate and all of that, wanting to see Palestinians clear the land for them to take it over. This settler terrorism, as a matter of fact, is in fact being condoned by Israeli government. It's intended to intimidate, and it has taken the form now going beyond, torching places of worship and olive trees and what have you, to attacking people and killing them. And all of this goes on with impunity, unfortunately.
Donald Trump's leverage was a critical factor, if not the critical factor, in getting to the ceasefire last October, I believe.
Yes, it
early
was.
October.
Yes.
It does not seem that Trump has used much leverage, or his officials have used much leverage since then. Is that impression correct? And to the extent that you would like the U.S. to do more, how should it be using that leverage?
Yeah, President Trump has demonstrated that he actually can get Israel to do things if he thought they were important enough at certain points in time. There are many examples of this. As a matter of fact, going back to the first time when the U.S. In June of last year had the Iranian installations and missiles back and forth between Israel and Iran. And famously when he said just cut it out, and in ways that at least publicly.
This is the 12-day war last
Yes,
June.
in a way that we at least publicly are not used to seeing U.S. presidents act like. There's no question in my mind that confrontations took place and previous administrations, presidents were frustrated with Israeli actions here and there. But I don't recall ever having seen anything kind of play out publicly in the way that it did since Trump came on scene. He used that clearly to bring about the ceasefire, something which, if you look at the deal, it's actually virtually identical to the plan that former President Biden actually wrote out. The same one. The difference was, Trump and his intervention that made it possible. Since then, now and then, President Trump showed signs of being able to influence Israeli actions using a lot of public diplomacy, if you will, statements, tweets, or what have you, things that he would issue and say. All suggests to me of his ability to actually make a difference in the way things are going. The extent to which that can happen, I think, is related to two things. Number one, whether or not he is of a certain view that time has come for this issue to be resolved, and in getting there for behavior to begin to change in a way that is actually conducive to that change taking place. And secondly, the speed with which he can get out of, the aftermath of the Iran war that he started in late January, in late February. So these two things we'll see.
How do you understand the current status of Hamas? Israel has gone very aggressively after anyone involved in planning the October 7th attacks, but full disarmament hasn't happened. Hamas still seems to be one of the most important authorities in the half of Gaza that is not under Israeli occupation at that point. What do you understand about where Hamas is and how Hamas sees its own place at this point?
Looking at it from afar, obviously I'm not close to what's going on and all reporting and what have you, and reading between the lines, sometimes reading the lines themselves. It was always clear to me that, Hamas was not really on board. They were kind of cajoled into through the mediators, Turkey, Qatar, others, Egypt, of course, to move in the direction of accepting the Trump plan as a basis of moving forward. And they have several concerns, giving up governance in Gaza. Now, on the question of giving up governance in Gaza to a non-Hamas entity, at least as a matter of statements and publicly made by Hamas officials, they all along, since the early days of the war, expressed willingness to surrender governance in Gaza. Governance is a big word, and it includes, among other things, security and certainly arms. So if they were willing to give up governance to a non-Hamas entity or a non-Hamas controlled entity, I'm not sure the extent to which they were willing to accept the disarmament part of it, given the extent to which that is linked very much as a matter of constitution to who they are as an organization, their own ideology and all of that. So it was clear to me that they grudgingly kind of went along to make that happen. And the same thing can be said about Israel and Netanyahu and all of that. It's not that they were really keen to embrace everything that was in the plan and all of that. There was a lot of back and forth, if you recall, and in getting the plan kind of right enough for it to pass, but getting beyond the initial phase of saying, yes, we agree, and against the backdrop of what we all know, or the reluctance on the part of Hamas to kind of accept it as it was. I'm not going to say anything about Israel here, but the same can be said about Israel. These issues tend to come back to haunt you when you put together a plan. You're keyed up and you're really focused completely on getting something over the hump. But unless you follow it up by something really concrete to kind of move forward, then those issues that in the first instance were stumbling blocks would rear their head again back into the realm of things that actually influence the trajectory of things in the most negative of ways. And that's where we are now. Hamas, of course, when they present their reaction to a plan, they don't say, as a matter of constitution, we can't accept this. What they say is, we have a deal to which we are a party, yes, but the deal has not been respected by Israel. Israel continues to assassinate people. Israel continues to mount raids on Gaza. The humanitarian conditions, the human condition in Gaza has not improved in the least. So all of these things are happening and all of that. How do you expect us to hold our end of the bargain when That's true, and I have a lot of sympathy with that. But is that really the underlying reason why they're not moving? I think to move forward, one needs to understand, where Hamas is on this issue really, and try to address it. Among other things, I just mentioned to you what Hamas has said to kind of rationalize their reluctance to move forward in the question of governance. They said we're willing to actually deal with the question of disarmament in the context of an agreed to Palestinian Authority. Now, it seems to me that that's something important, something to try to capitalize on. If you are in the realm of working in the realm of diplomacy, you look for an opening like this and see, look, what do you mean by this? Is there an opening here? That part of it happens to align with something that I've advocated for myself since the very beginning of the war, including in that piece which you referenced at the outset in Foreign Affairs.
Before we get to the Palestinian Authority, the PA piece of this, there's one other piece of Gaza governance that I'm curious to hear your take on. In the ceasefire plan and the aftermath, there's this kind of vision of technocratic, non-Hamas, non-PA governance. Does that have any traction? Does that mean anything?
To be quite honest with you, let me just, if I may, go back to the genesis of this. I mean, this goes back to the very early days of the war, shortly after October 7. First time for me to hear about something like this as a possible idea in terms of what happens post-war in Gaza, post-war governance arrangement of Gaza. And the idea was precisely this, to have a committee of technocrats from Gaza, civil society types and what have you, who have no people with no factional affiliation, take over and become the political address for Gaza. Now, when I heard about this first, which was literally a few days after October 7, no more than a week after October 7, I reacted to it in almost like a very angry way the minute I heard about it.
This was coming from Israeli officials, from international ones, from Americans?
I first heard about it from a U.S. official, as a matter of fact. It's like asking my view. It's like, what do you think if something like this were to happen? And I remember, it was October in 2023 when that happened. I mean, literally a few days after October 7, I recall reacting to it angrily. And I was asked, like, why are we reacting to it this way? I said, well, the reason for this is simple. To me, this presumes that the day after in Gaza, on the day after in Gaza, Gaza will be Hamasless or free of Hamas influence. And that's a tall order. It's impossible to achieve. And in the process of trying to get there, tens of thousands of Palestinians are going to get killed. There's no question, there's no way that I can begin to see this a sensible way to get to the objective of addressing in a fundamentally right way the question of post-war governance in Gaza. The other reason why I didn't think it made sense, but this is fundamentally why I thought the idea was not a good idea. The other reason why is that obviously in the minds of those who were thinking about post-war governance in Gaza, that they were thinking in political terms. They were thinking for an political alternative to Hamas in Gaza. Now, to me, it doesn't add up. A committee of individuals, you put together a group of people like this, is not by definition a political entity. It is not going to be, nor is it going to be seen at the outset as a political home for people to gravitate to in Gaza. So there was a problem with it also this way. But my bigger problem with it was what I just said to you, that it really presumed that Hamas was not going to be around the after in Gaza. And that assumption, of course, was flawed. So years later, after many rounds of negotiations that involved discussions between among Palestinian factions, Arab mediation, Egyptian mediation, and what have you, people somehow gravitated back to the model of having a committee of technocrats from Gaza addressing the needs of Gaza to administer Gaza the day after. Now, where are we on this? This goes back to October of last year. The committee is still sitting in Cairo, not able to even show up in Gaza for a variety of reasons.
I suppose that call with the U.S. official elicited the blueprint that you laid out in Foreign Affairs. And again, I think it was a couple of weeks after the attack.
Yeah.
That involved bringing in some Hamas members, those who were not directly involved in planning the October 7th attacks. It also meant changing the nature of Palestinian Authority leadership. Yeah. How would you update that now, given where we are?
I will. But just one last word on the question of Committee Anur. When it happened, after the ceasefire, Anur, I was supportive of the idea because I'm a very pragmatic person. So I was supportive of it, even if I had all of the hesitation and all, and I had an alternative, which to this day, I believe, is far superior to anything that has been done so far, and could be the answer to the state of stalemate, if you will, that we are in right now. Because looking at the situation as it stands, not wishfully, but as it stands today, there's no question that the Trump plan has stalled for a variety of reasons. Yes, the latest version of Gulf War is a factor of distraction, but also because of these structural issues that actually were there from the very beginning and stood in the way of smooth implementation. Not that any plan can be expected to be implemented smoothly. So, yeah, past the immediate anger and being taken aback by anyone thinking about a committee of technocrats taking over in Gaza, I thought to myself, why don't I just sit down and come up with an alternative? And that was basically what underlay the piece that you published for me in Foreign Affairs in late October of 2023. And the basic idea was there, it's political. This is something that's been with me for a long period of time, long before October 7. And I honestly believe, had we put ourselves on a path of unity before, maybe October 7 would never have happened.
Of Palestinian unity.
Yeah. And to this day, I believe, unless that's really starting point of conversation moving forward for us Palestinians, we're never going to put ourselves on a path of empowerment that actually is built on the idea of assuming full agency in the act of our liberation. That's key to me. And I thought, okay, here we are. Well, it's just begun. How can we really do something that could bring this war to an end quickly before a lot of people are killed and all of that? We do the thing that's really overdue. Unify Palestinian polity, which came fractured in a very, very bad way in mid-2007 upon the violent takeover power by Hamas in Gaza. You need to find a way for political accommodation. I mean, human nature is what it is. But in the end, people need to look for ways in which there is political accommodation. That's when you can lay the foundation for a stable equilibrium. So I thought, like it or not, here we are. We, like other people, do not think the same. We do not wear the same clothes. We do not think the same thing about our cause, how it's going to be resolved, what kind of ideology, what kind of organizing principles should guide us on the path of liberation and all that. Why should we be singled out among all peoples around the world for the expectation of, when it comes to something as fundamental as how we think about the way to liberation, to be uniform in our own thinking and rule? Can we find a way in which somehow we can deal with this pluralism, if you will, in an effective way, something that can serve our cause and objective? And the answer to that question to me was a Palestinian Authority that, after years of decline in its legitimacy and standing for a variety of reasons that I went into in that piece, among many other contributions that I have made, that Palestinian Authority needs to be reinvigorated, needs to be made into something that's the product of national consensus. How do you do that? It was not a question of really picking and choosing few people from Hamas or anything like that. It involved thinking about the entire structure of our body politic. There is the PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization, that's supposed to be home for all Palestinians. But over time, it became home to a part of us, not all of us, particularly after the failure of Oslo to deliver on the promise of statehood and all of that sort of thing. And we cannot ignore that. I mean, it's inconvenient for us not to be all subscribing to the platform of the one organization that's supposed to represent all of us. It's not inconvenient. It's a major problem. But we need to find a way to deal with it. And my suggestion was to try to actually make it inclusive, find a way to really make it home for everybody again. And this involved coming up with ideas about bringing all people around the table at the level of the PLO, not the Palestinian Authority. There is a distinction. Palestinian Authority is an entity that came into being as a product of the Oslo Accords back in 1994. That's when it was created. But the PLO predated it. PLO is the umbrella organization for all of us. But it ceased to be home for the majority of us, and progressively so since late 90s, when Oslo failed to deliver on promise of statehood. So my proposal, going back to October, actually even before, I wrote for Foreign Affairs going back to 2015, a similar piece, saying you bring Hamas to the upper echelon, the PLO. it has to be a part of this, but somehow there is a problem with platform. Hamas does not subscribe to the platform of PLO, and PLO, President Abbas and Executive Committee PLO as it stood, did not want to alter the platform that made it possible for them to enter to the Oslo Accords and whatnot. So there is this problem.
And that's about a commitment to nonviolence. What is
It was about recognizing the right of the State of Israel to exist in peace and security. And second is actually commitment to nonviolence and all. And I think there are ways to deal with this. And I actually laid that out on more than one occasion. But going back to Gaza, the fundamental approach to try to deal with this issue was to actually bring Hamas into that PLO thing. And PLO is led by something that's called Executive Committee. And going back to early 2000s, in dialogue that took place, national dialogue that took place, with a view to finding a way to Hamas to be included. This goes back to the days of our late President Yasser Arafat. And the person who led the PLO's delegation to those negotiations in Cairo was none other than current President Abbas himself. That dialogue created something called Unified Leadership Framework. What is that Unified Leadership Framework? Unified Leadership Framework is the executive committee of the PLO as it exists today, as it existed then, as it continues to exist today, plus the Secretaries General of the factions that are not included in the PLO. So it's kind of broader umbrella. So the idea was to activate something that I did not invent myself. It was always there, to dust it off and activate it and really get it to do something meaningful. What is the main mission? What is the main task of this body in the piece that I actually wrote for Foreign Affairs? To consent to a government that's not factional, to run Gaza and the West Bank for transitional period, length of which to be agreed in negotiations, and to get on with it and send the government to Gaza immediately. This is government for both Gaza and West Bank. It's agreed to by the PLO as expanded within this unified leadership framework, and the sole function for that body at that juncture, at that point in time, all they need to do is to agree to a government of national consensus, to consent to a non-factional government, one that is not made up of Hamas or by Hamas, one that's not made up by any other faction, and just agree to it and let it run the affairs of Palestinian people, both in Gaza and the West Bank, for a transitional period. And all of this to be underpinned by commitment to nonviolence and what have you. That was the idea.
How much of a problem is President Abbas?
The idea of trying to unify Palestinian unity through the PLO and then have a transitional period underpinned by commitment to nonviolence and to end with national elections where, factions and everyone else would be allowed to compete and all of that after a period of stabilization, opening up political space and all. It's something that I personally discussed with President Abbas. Last time I did so was back in 2021. So I suspected that was not really going to be too keen on it. Events since then actually proved me right on this, and as evidenced by the fact that all Palestinian factions, including Fatah and Hamas, they met in Beijing in July of 2024, after then President Biden rolled out his peace plan for Gaza. They met in July. By the way, that unified leadership framework, the last time it had met was in July of 2023, right before, in Al Alamein in Egypt. And it didn't do anything. They just basically issued a statement and all of that sort of thing. But they met again, not as unified leadership framework, because the president was not there. All factions met in Beijing in July 2024. And guess what? They agreed essentially to, the ideas that I have just described to you. To really get this unified leadership framework, to consent to a national consensus government, as they called it. And they all signed off a document that said, this is what we want to happen. So Hamas kind of really moved from saying, we're open to something. And, in the world of politics, the difference between somebody says, I want something to happen, I'm open to something. There's a big distance between the two. So they signaled not willing. They're part of an agreement that said, we want to do this. So did Fatah, by the way. They signed that agreement, all other factions. Now, you asked me about President Abbas's position. All I know is that the step that needed to follow that agreement did not happen. The step that needed to follow that agreement was for the president to convene, because he is the one person who has convening power over that unified leadership framework, to convene that unified leadership framework, for it to actually do that and agree to a consensus government. He did not do that. I mean, that to me, more than anything else, regardless of statements made here and there, suggests to me that he was not really for it that much. By the way, I can say this, sadly, also about some regional actors. There was not really that much enthusiasm, and so the thing continued to go on, and the war continued until there was a ceasefire, and then we went back to the idea of committee. It's there, it sits there. So you ask me, like, how do we move forward given all of what has happened? You have come up with all of these ideas. There is a board of peace, there is committee, but there is no question that the effort has stalled in some way. And to move forward, just keep the committee, keep everything, but get on with this other second act, along with everything that you have done. Get on with the act of having one government, one Palestinian government that's not made up of factions for Gaza and the West Bank, to begin to address the needs of people, to be the face of Palestinian people in Gaza and West Bank, to the world also, which, by the way, is also consistent with what is in that plan about, at some point, the Palestinian Authority being put on a path of getting us to self-determination and all of that. After they say it's reform. That's not something I agree with. By the way, question, reform. What we really need is political reconfiguration in the way that I've described.
You think the Palestinian Authority is beyond salvation?
I honestly believe the way it's constituted politically right now, it's not reformable. Not that if it could really undertake reforms in the technocratic sense that are supposed to improve financial management, for example, security management, and what have you, that is something that is not needed or anything like that. To the contrary, it is needed, and it's something that can and should be pursued. But in the way the Palestinian Authority is constituted right now, and it has been for quite a number of years, structurally speaking, without really getting into much detail, I think that's really dead end. But beyond that, even if it were not, even if the PA did not really have these structural problems that I have in mind when I say it's not reformable, even if we were to become like as well managed as Finland, would that really by itself be enough to make the Palestinian Authority a product of national consensus, thus able to show up in Gaza? My answer is no.
But it's just quite striking that President Abbas, who is the president of the Palestinian Authority, has the some degree of legitimacy, that hasn't had an election in a very long time, is 91 years old, but still has that position, has not been a forceful leader for the Palestinian national movement globally through this entire period. I mean, that just seems like a vacuum there.
It is in some way, and it's most regrettable. Look, when you, as the main address for Palestinian people, as a home for Palestinian people, early on, going back to October 7, and say, not me, I have nothing to do with this, that's Hamas, and not, etc., etc. You don't really set yourself up rightly to assume leadership in the most dramatically needed way at the moment. You are the address. You should really grab that bull by the horns and assert yourself and presence and speak for the people. And go beyond the complaints and all of that. Bring everybody on board and say, this is what we need to do. You'd find that people would respond positively to that. But that did not happen. I mean, basically, the PA, Palestinian Authority, decided to sit this one out in some way. And that kind of created a lot of void. And that created a situation where something which President Abbas did not want to see happen, I'm sure, in PLO, Palestinian Authority, all of the negotiations actually took place on behalf of Gaza, took place effective by Hamas, which is kind of really something. That's just not how we're supposed to be led. We're supposed to be led by a unified Palestinian polity, whether it's in Gaza, whether it's West Bank. Ours is a national cause. It's about nothing short of liberation, nothing short of being able to live as free people within a country of our own. That requires, that kind of leadership. That was missing. It was not exercised, and we're paying for it right now.
We'll return to my conversation with Salam Fayyad after a short break. I want to zoom out before we close and just talk a bit about how we move forward on the situation more broadly. I think one striking feature of the international debate here has been the push for recognition and the decide to recognize the state of Palestine by, I don't know how many governments at this point over the last few years. Is that helpful? Is that meaningful? Does that move the ball forward in any way?
Going back to the days when there was such a drive back in 2011 that culminated in 2012 with us being granted status of a non-member state in the United Nations. It was historic in many ways. But
You were prime minister at the
I
time?
was
or-
prime minister at the time, but I really had my doubt about the efficacy of that whole approach to getting us to what we needed to do. I was always guided by what brought us closer to rendezvous with freedom. And I was afraid that actually when we got something like this, it would look like we got something meaningful, real, materially so on the path to liberation, but something that really actually in the end would end up being worse than a placebo, and something that would really make us feel like we're accomplishing something or we're not. From the very beginning, and I really argued strongly when I was prime minister, I used to attend the PLO executive committee meetings as an observer, that we really need to rethink this whole approach. And I was not really sure that it was going to really bring us closer to end of occupation, that if anything, that I thought that the reality of occupation was going to get progressively worse following something like that. That's exactly what happened. Now, that's not my attitude toward the recognition of Palestinian statehood, generally speaking. I mean, I break it down into three phases. Phase one is that followed the famous speech given by our late leader Yasser Arafat in Algiers, which he declared the establishment of the State of Palestine back in 1988. Thereafter, a lot of countries recognized us out of sympathy with the Palestinian cause, and I have nothing but full appreciation for the global South, if you will, generally. Of course, Arab countries, Muslim countries, African countries, Latin American countries, Asian countries. They did it out of sympathy with us, and that's just not something I take lightly at all. Then there was this mid-phase that I just described to you in 2011, 2012. The most recent round, that is something that I really thought was the product a lot more of leaders in countries addressing their own political needs in post-October 7 and all, trying to placate their own domestic audiences and all. It was cynical, in some instances more so than others. And the classic example of where I was actually totally annoyed by the way it was done was by British Prime Minister, when he actually is on record. They can check me out on this, and if I'm wrong, please correct me, because to this day I'm pained by it. All countries, Britain, here his Prime Minister says, like, unless Israel does A, B, and C, the United Kingdom is going to recognize State of Palestine, making it sound like State of Palestine is punishment to Israel. I mean, that's just really unbelievably unhelpful and constructive and offensive in every way. So you have that. To tell you the truth, I'm not very happy about that. It's not that I'm opposed to any kind of recognition. Instead, what I think should happen is for us to put ourselves on a path of that, the goal of which is to secure recognition of our right to a sovereign state on the territory Israel occupied in 1967 in its entirety. There is a big difference between the two. A difference between saying we recognize you as a state without defining what that means. There is a big difference between that and the entire Palestinian political project being anchored on trying to secure recognition of our right to a state, sovereign state, on the territory Israel occupied in 1967 in its entirety. With that actually constituting the cornerstone of any meaningful political process going forward. Now, is Israel ever going to really recognize our right to anything as a people? I doubt it, not in the near future. Much less so to a right to a state on any part of the West Bank, especially the West Bank, of any kind, minus sovereignty, whatever. That's not going to happen. It's not. But how about trying to really put ourselves on path of diplomatic effort aimed at getting this recognition enshrined in the United Nations Security Council resolution? That to me is as good. That's something that not Netanyahu, not any Israeli government can have a veto over.
In the regional dimension, I'm curious about your views of the Abraham Accords. Has that been net positive or negative for the Palestinian government?
I think the entire effort needs to be recalibrated now. It's not simply an act of let's expand the accords and see what is required to expand them and all. Let's just really look at the core of this. And if you go back to the rationale behind the accords, beyond that which is declared, integrate Israel in the region, prosperity for all and everything else, that somehow presumed that, Palestinian issue, long viewed as a core issue and all of that to be dealt with, was going to be dealt with. Well, it was not. I don't blame the Abraham Accords per se for that. I mean, we're on that path of destruction anyway. But we are where we are. I mean, to think that just by themselves, that path is going to pull that wagon for any sustainable period. I'm not sure. So I'm all for going back to the basics. And insofar as we are concerned, we need to. It has to start with us. That's the thing. That's what's missing. Like when we look around to Arab countries, we talk about Abraham Accords. We're critical of Abraham Accords. We're for this. We're against that. But what are we really for in terms of not only saying that we want to exercise our right to self-determination, which is obviously something that we all should enlist to do, but how we're going to get there? I think it's really up to us to say, given all we know about the lay of the land, where we are, the complications, the depth of the hole we are in, how about if we begin to dig out of this? First, stop digging. How about if we start to emerge from this by saying the path to freedom, as far as we're concerned, begins with securing international recognition of our right to a sovereign state on the territory occupied by Israel. Then, incrementally, I think we are on a path that promises delivery. That's something that could form basis.
And is that for all the reasons that it looks fanciful or delusional at this point, that is ultimately something that resembles the two-state solution of old, or is that a different formula?
I think it definitely could end up with that for sure, because if you listen to what I have just said about recognizing our right to a sovereign state where? On the territory Israel occupied in 1967 in its entirety. That's West Bank, Gaza, including Jerusalem. That's what we're talking about. And that's the original conception of the modern version of two-state solution. But, post-Oslo, post-1988, especially post-1988, the position of the PLO representing all Palestinians was precisely this. And by the way, what I'm really saying about the need for our right to statehood on the territory Israel occupied in 1967 being recognized, it's not that outlandish. I mean, you said something fanciful, not in reference to that in particular. But if you go back to the original formulation of Oslo Accords, everybody says declaration of mutual recognition. There's nothing mutual about that declaration. The PLO, acting on behalf of all Palestinians, recognized the right of the state of Israel to exist peace and security. Not recognize Israel or its existence. It recognized its right to exist peace and security. So what I'm really talking about fundamentally, it's about, basically closing that circle, squaring that circle. Again, we started with that. Why don't we make it completely reciprocal?
So in some ways, going back to the North Star that was set on the Oslo Accord.
If people are talking about two-state solution, let's start with that. Let's start by redressing this asymmetry that actually happened back in 1993. And, had we had a state by end of the 90s, I would not be saying what I'm saying today. It didn't happen. So there is a structural flaw. Let's fix it. Now, I said to you myself, it's fanciful to expect any government in Israel, for all kinds of ideological reasons, to concede that kind of recognition. Too many. We're not even a people. You know what I'm saying? With any national rights. For us to have a right to any territory, particularly the West Bank, is not something that I can really realistically expect. That's why I'm suggesting this workaround to go through the United Nations Security Council as well. We Palestinians should consider that adequate as a basis for resuming a serious political process with Israel.
And do you think Palestinian public opinion would shift as well?
I think with adequate transparency and beginning to really actually act in a manner that discernibly means something positive for people, providing that horizon so far as freedom is concerned. But most importantly, beginning with the here and now, doing the most basic of things that any responsible and responsive government is expected to do vis-a-vis its people, to serve their interests, to have their welfare, its North Star. That's basically what we need to. If you start with that, that's when you begin to build legitimacy. That's what I really actually call legitimacy that derives from delivery.
Trying to end this on something like an optimistic note, if you imagine good leadership, you imagine the use of leverage by regional capitals, Washington, perhaps a change in leadership in Israel, and a Palestinian government that can build this kind of legitimacy and shift the politics within the West Bank and Gaza. Where, let's say in 5 years, where might that leave us? What's a kind of plausible but optimistic scenario there?
I think at the minimum, if all of these things, if all of these factors actually materialize, we definitely will be in a much better place than we are right now. we will have begun to deal with the most terrible humanitarian conditions in Gaza. We will have begun to actually inspire people, give them some sense of hope about better tomorrow, for sure. And hopefully people will begin to see light at the end of the tunnel. But I cannot really overstate the importance of delivery in the meantime. That's what's really important. It's one thing to really talk about reconstruction and all of that, but it's another to begin with simple tasks of delivering on that. However modestly that effort can begin with.
Meaning making daily life better.
And incrementally build on it and be transparent about your objectives, what it is to. Above all, government for the people. We're not going to real government by the people overnight, but government for the people is the very least. Any responsible leadership should deliver to its own people. That's the basic minimum. And if that is something to be expected of any government around the world, it's most certainly something that should be expected of Palestinian leadership in the government. For our people under oppressive occupation, that is intended to make itself permanent. So there's no question that it's a tall order, and it does require that kind of leadership, openness, transparency, responsiveness, delivery, in the best possible sense of the word.
Salam, thank you for the pieces you've done in foreign affairs over the years, laying out some elements of this. We'll hope to have more, bring those up to date soon. But for now, thank you so much for doing this today.
Much appreciated. Thank you, Dan, for having me. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. You can find the articles that we discussed on today's show at foreignaffairs.com. This episode of the Foreign Affairs Interview was produced by Rachel Powell and Kanish Tharoor. Our audio engineer is Todd Yeager, with audio help from Christopher Cook. Original music is by Robin Hilton. Special thanks as well to Arena Hogan. Make sure you subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts, and if you like what you heard, please take a minute to rate and review it. We release a new show every Thursday. Thanks again for tuning in.